The Yom Kippur War is often remembered through a familiar lens. Israel, surrounded by hostile neighbors, standing its ground against overwhelming odds. It's a narrative that stuck for decades, underpinning billions of dollars in US military aid. And yes, it's true, Egypt and Syria launched the war in October 1973, catching Israel off guard. But here's the part that's often left out. Egypt and Syria weren't attacking out of nowhere. They were fighting to take back land Israel had seized in 1967 during the Six-Day War. A war Israel started with a preemptive strike on Egypt. The Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights weren't just military objectives, they were pieces of their nations. For Egypt and Syria, the 1973 war wasn't about destroying Israel, but about reclaiming what had been theirs. Yet that side of the story rarely makes it into the mainstream narrative, which continues to frame the conflict as Israel's fight for survival, leaving the deeper complexities in the background. Half a century has passed since the 1973 October War. Yet which side emerged victorious from this pivotal conflict remains an open question that is still debated endlessly, both globally and in the Middle East. Both sides claim to have won the October War. Neither will admit defeat. Both sides manufactured stories to be written into national history books. However, for years, the Israeli and American side of the story has dominated a biased narrative. A narrative where the Israelis give the impression that they were merely caught by surprise, and that once they had recovered their balance, they drove back the Arabs on both fronts, crossed the Suez Canal, penetrated into Africa, and surrounded the Egyptian Third Army with ease. They further claim that only intervention by the superpowers saved the Third Army from surrendering and the Israelis from advancing further, as the road to Cairo lay open before them. This was by no means the correct picture, and by perpetuating it, the Israelis are in danger of falling into the same errors of self-deception and overconfidence that they did after the 1967 war. Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir viewed Egyptian President Anwar Sadat's attempts at diplomacy and saber-rattling as largely ineffective. On the 6th of May 1973, at the anniversary of the founding of Israel, she replied to a question on the possibility of Sadat's starting a war. Sadat can gain nothing by war. He knows this. But all the same, we believe he may act. If so, we are ready. It is doubtful that she really thought Sadat would launch an attack on Israel, but speaking from a position of strength, this statement served as a warning to the Egyptians not to attempt any military adventures. Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan believed that the canal is the best defense line we could hope for. His policy, in brief, was to remain behind the Bar-Lev line and wait for the Arabs to make peace, feeling that Israel could indefinitely sustain a condition of no peace, no war.
Well, what are going to be the next steps? Who's going to telephone who in order to secure a long-term solution for the Middle East problem?
I think that we can wait for a call. I don't see anything wrong with the present situation. I don't know why should we approach anyone about anything. As far as I'm concerned, we are just happy as it is now. And if the others are happy, so that's it.
But the others aren't going to be happy, really, are they?
Let them ring us up.
In this frame of mind, the Israelis either overlooked, ignored, or brushed aside as trivial many of the more obvious signs of Arab military preparation. The Israelis relied heavily on the alleged technological gap between themselves and the Arabs. They openly boasted and firmly believed that it would be at least 2 generations before the Arabs could catch up. It was a mistaken presumption. The Egyptians were learning fast. For example, at their Technical Training Institute, certain SAM-2 training equipment had been received and was still in crates when the Russians left in July 1972. The Russians estimated that it would take 29 Soviet experts about 9 months to install it. Egyptian instructors and students completed the job in 50 days. Also, the Egyptians made certain modifications to the SAMs, radar equipment, and their electronic countermeasures, which the Israelis did not learn about in time, another well-kept secret. The radar and electronic capability of the Egyptians was grossly underestimated by the Israelis and others. The way the Egyptians manned and operated their sophisticated air defense barrier and the fact that it worked at all, let alone so well, was indicative of their advance in this field. Sadat capitalized on Israel's superiority complex, weaving it seamlessly into his strategy of deception. Israel believed that their quality was still superior to Arab quantity, and that their young, energetic, capable generals were superior to those of the Arabs, as was the Israeli soldier to his Arab counterpart. Israeli forces would soon learn that their assumptions were fatally flawed. I had some slight hopes of Secretary of State Rogers in 1970 and 1971, but all he did was to extract more and more concessions from me, and there was never a single response from the Israelis. Rogers thought we would never fight. The Israelis thought we would never fight, and they thought they could never be surprised. The West thought we were poor soldiers without good generals. Sadat's statement probably held the key to his subsequent course of action. The president's wounded Egyptian pride had made him determined to wipe out the psychological effects of the 1967 defeat and one day achieve a victory that would put Egypt on the military map of the world. Colonel Shimon Mendez, who served in the military intelligence unit during the October War, said that Anwar Sadat and his generals succeeded in creating a third type of strategic military bluff, called it sedation, which is more dangerous than the traditional misleading or confusion strategies.
It is an all-out war. That's how Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan describes an invasion of the Golan Heights and the east bank of the Suez by Syria and Egypt.
On October 6, 1973, Egyptian forces launched an unprecedented surprise attack across the Suez Canal, catching Israeli defenses off guard. Egyptian commandos and sapper teams swiftly crossed the canal, neutralizing Israeli defenses on the east bank, while engineers constructed numerous bridges, allowing Egyptian divisions to cross over with speed. When the inevitable Israeli armored counterattack came, the Egyptians met them with teams armed with RPGs and Saga anti-tank guided missiles, inflicting heavy losses on Israeli tanks. By the end of the second day, the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd armies, numbering a combined 5 divisions and 80,000 men, were ensconced on the east bank. The next day, the Israelis launched a 2-division attack. Once more, the Israelis were met by a wall of RPGs and Saga missiles. Above them, Israeli air cover was held back by the new SA-7 SAM missile, which Israeli radar could not detect. Those Israeli tanks that managed to break through were swarmed by Egyptian infantry. By the end of the day, the Israelis had lost at least 150 tanks, 30 Skyhawks, 10 Phantoms, and a proportion of their best pilots, the cream of the hunter squadrons. The shock to the Israeli government and GHQ was immense. The Israelis fell back in disarray. In the space of 48 hours, the Egyptians had won a great victory, crossing the canal, capturing the fortifications along the Bar-Lev line, and stopping 2 Israeli counterattacks. General Ariel Sharon, who played a pivotal role in the war, called the first few days a disaster, a tankman's nightmare, and said the Israeli High Command was left in a state of shock. The Egyptians had no plans to advance deeper into the Sinai. As planned by Chief of Staff General Saad al-Shazli, the Egyptian army was to remain on the Suez's east bank as a fait accompli. A fact on the ground meant to force the Israelis to negotiate the Sinai's return. The war brought many surprises that jolted military thinking out of its World War II rut and provoked wide-ranging reassessments. It was a war that was not wanted by either the Russians or the Americans, but once it had begun, both America and Russia felt compelled to sustain their protégés for reasons of prestige and the superpower struggle. They sent replacement arms, ammunition, and equipment in quantities that escalated widely, as neither superpower wanted to see the side it was supporting defeated completely on the field of battle. In an interview with the Jerusalem Post, Kissinger said, "It was clear that the attacking armies had made extensive advances, but the US was determined from the beginning to prevent an Arab victory which we looked at as a Soviet victory. I went to Nixon and told him we needed another level of airlift to affect the situation, that we needed a military airlift. And then Nixon, in his characteristic way, which was that once the decision was made, he did the full scale of it to the extent that it could be done. He ordered the immediate airlift for the Israelis, and we began a major military airlift on Friday evening and at full scale on Saturday morning."
But there was no doubt in my mind, no doubt in Henry Kissinger's mind, as to what we should do. Israel had to be saved. I said, it's got to be done by American planes. And I remember that Henry Kissinger negotiated with the Defense Department and said, we have a plan. We will send 3 C-5As. And I said, well, 3 doesn't seem like very many. I said, how many do we have? He said, well, I don't know. I think about 25. I said, send all 25. He said, but the Defense Department people believe that if we send 25, that's more than the traffic will bear politically. And I said, look, I'll take care of the politics. We'll get blamed just as much for 3 as if we send 25. I said, I want you to send everything that can fly.
On October 13th, the US conducted Operation Nickel Grass, the largest airlift of armaments since World War II. The American airlift began on October 13th and ended on November 14th. It carried over 22,395 tons of M48 and M60 tanks, howitzers, advanced artillery, CH-53 helicopters, and A-4 Skyhawks. A virtual arsenal airlifted overnight to Israel's front lines. Syria's early victories were short-lived. By the 8th of October, the Israeli forces had managed to repel Syrian paratrooper attacks on their lines and managed to send successful airstrikes against military targets in and around Damascus. By the 10th of October, Israel succeeded to push into Syria. Syrian defenses were inadequate to repel the assault, and within a few days, Israeli artillery was able to fire on Damascus and quickly established air superiority over Syria. Meanwhile, the Sinai front slowed since the 10th of October. Both sides spent days preparing for a renewed offensive. The Egyptians moved first, hoping to force Israel to shift divisions from the Golan to the Sinai front, hoping to ease the pressure on the Syrians, who were by now on the defensive. The Egyptians launched a massive armored assault on October 14th, in spite of objections to the lack of air cover raised by some top generals. Almost 400 Egyptian tanks stormed deeper into the Sinai beyond the cover of their SAM defenses, and the attack utterly failed. In less than a day, the Egyptians lost over 250 armored vehicles. In the afternoon of the 15th, the Israelis decided to cross the Suez Canal and exploit on the West Bank, but there had been considerable hesitation, not to say trepidation, about launching such an operation. Both General Elazar and General Bar-Lev had come round to the idea, and they had discussed the matter with Dayan. The latter was not very enthusiastic, as he did not think it would bring about a military decision or force the Egyptians to ask for a ceasefire. But several factors led to the Israeli decision to cross the Suez Canal. The major considerations were that the Israelis reckoned they had won a big battle on the 14th, had driven the Egyptians back to their bridgeheads, and had inflicted heavy tank losses. Also, that day the United States openly admitted that it was mounting air and sea lifts of military supply for Israel, which gave the Israelis a terrific morale boost. As well, information gained by the American SR-71 spy aircraft on the 13th confirmed that on both sides of the canal south of Ismailia and on the shores of Great Bitter Lake, there was an area about 40 kilometers in width that was almost empty of troops. The Israeli plan aimed to cross the canal near Devassois, secure a 5-kilometer corridor, and establish a bridgehead for paratroopers and armor. By October 16th, at least one bridge was to be operational, enabling forces to attack north, south, and west, with the goal of encircling Egyptian forces and capturing Suez and Ismailia by October 18th. However, execution deviated significantly from the plan, revealing the timeline to be highly optimistic and extremely unrealistic. Before the Israelis could cross the canal, they sought to secure their flank against the Egyptian Second Army, positioned just a few kilometers north in a small agricultural area known as the Chinese Farm. However, they quickly discovered they were not only facing a heavily reinforced Egyptian infantry division, but also found themselves confronting an Egyptian armored division. Determined Egyptian resistance made progress extremely slow for the Israelis, who suffered heavy losses. The Israelis were repeatedly reinforced with armor, but were unable to make much headway, only managing to seize an important crossroad on the second day. Suffering from a lack of infantry, the Israelis brought up paratroopers during the night of October 16th to 17th. They were tasked with clearing anti-tank defenses for the armor, but they became pinned down by heavy Egyptian fire. The paratroopers drew Egyptian attention long enough for the Israelis to move bridging equipment to the canal undetected. Armored forces later extricated the paratroopers. The Egyptians attempted to restore their defenses to their initial dispositions with an armored attack on October 17th. It initially succeeded, but was pushed back by Israeli counterattacks in an armored battle lasting the entire day. Seriously depleted by the continuous fighting, the Egyptians relinquished control of the routes to the canal, opening them up to the Israelis. The Battle of the Chinese Farm has an especially infamous legacy among Israeli participants, and it is remembered as one of the most brutal battles of the war, and for the heavy losses incurred by both the Egyptians and Israelis. After the battle had ended, Diane visited the area of the battlefield and would recount that, "I am no novice at war or battle scenes, but I have never seen such a sight, not in reality, or in paintings, or in the worst war movies. Here was a vast field of slaughter, stretching as far as the eye could see." Sharon would also provide his own poignant account of the aftermath. It was as if a hand-to-hand battle of armor had taken place. Coming close, you could see the Egyptian and Jewish dead lying side by side, soldiers who had jumped from their burning tanks and died together. No picture could capture the horror of the scene. None could encompass what had happened there. The Egyptians assumed that the Israeli objective was to roll up the Second Army's right flank, not to open a corridor to the West Bank for Israeli forces to cross the canal. For the next 24 hours, this remained the general impression among Egyptian commanders, and they reacted accordingly. On the 16th of October, the paratroopers started crossing the canal in their assault boats. They were later joined by 10 tanks that had managed to break through and were ferried over on the SP pontoons. The Israelis sent raiding parties attacking Egyptian SAMs on the West Bank, while securing a 4-kilometer deep bridgehead without facing resistance. The Egyptians, meanwhile, failed to grasp the extent and magnitude of the Israeli crossing, nor did they appreciate its intent and purpose. They were under the impression that the canal crossing was merely a diversion for a major IDF offensive, targeting the right flank of the Second Army. Only after the 17th of October, the Egyptians slowly began to realize the magnitude of the Israeli offensive. Early on, 18 October, the Soviets showed Sadat satellite imagery of Israeli forces operating on the West Bank. Now Israel had 3 divisions on the West Bank under the command of Sharon, Adan, and Magan. Sharon's task was to move north to seize the canal city of Ismailia and thereby sever the logistical and supply lines for most of the Egyptian Second Army. Adan and Magan's divisions to move south to seize the city of Suez. As the Israelis pushed towards Ismailia, Sharon's brigades faced fierce resistance from Egyptian paratroopers and commandos. On 22nd October, the Israelis concentrated artillery and mortar fire against the city, and an Israeli paratrooper company attacked without first scouting ahead and was ambushed and annihilated. The Egyptian Commando Battalion managed to repel the attack after prolonged heavy fighting. Sharon's forces failed to get behind Ismailia and encircle the city, and their attack had been thoroughly routed. The Egyptians registered a tactical and strategic victory in the defense of Ismailia, stopping an encirclement of their large forces on the east bank of the Suez Canal and ensuring their supply lines remained open. In the meantime, Premier Kosygin met with Sadat and was trying to persuade him to accept a ceasefire, to which Sadat agreed, saying he had only wanted to break the no peace, no war stalemate and would honor a ceasefire if Israelis would withdraw from the occupied territories. Kosygin also wanted an assurance that Sadat would not use the Scuds against Israeli population centers, and again Sadat agreed, but only on the condition that the Israelis did not first attack his cities from the air. The hotline from Moscow to Washington, actually a teleprinter machine, was used for the first time in this war when First Secretary Brezhnev spoke to President Nixon, asking urgently that Kissinger come to Moscow for consultations. Nixon agreed. The UN Security Council passed a resolution calling for a ceasefire on October 22nd. And while the Egyptians seemed determined to honor the ceasefire, for example, the Cairo International Airport was briefly opened again, the Israelis, on the contrary, rushed troops across their 3 bridges throughout the night of the 22nd-23rd. It seemed they had no intention of observing the ceasefire, but were set upon exploiting their position on the West Bank. The fact that the Israelis broke the ceasefire and went on with their offensive led the Soviet Union to think the United States had deliberately outwitted it. They accused the US government of allowing Israel to violate the ceasefire on the 22nd and make territorial gains. There is evidence that Kissinger may have given tacit approval or deliberately refrained from restraining Israel in the immediate aftermath of the ceasefire. His strategic aim was to allow Israel to secure a more advantageous position before serious negotiations began. After the failed attempt to capture Ismailia, Israel tried to consolidate its position west of the canal and tried to exert pressure on Egypt before a ceasefire took full effect. Adan's division was ordered to quickly move south and take Suez and use it as a strategic leverage. The fall of such an important city would have been a significant blow to Egyptian morale. On the 23rd, Adan's company arrived at Suez and made a weak attack, which was held, and so the Israeli first attempt to enter Suez was balked. On the 24th, Adan chose to attack the city again, using a tank unit and a paratrooper battalion. They openly advanced along the wide main boulevard into the city, only to be fired upon suddenly from the buildings on either side of the roadway. They were surrounded, and the armored column was ambushed and severely hit. Within 20 minutes, 20 of the 24 Israeli tank commanders of the column who were exposed in their turrets were killed or wounded. The Israelis had not expected such stiff resistance. The Israelis admit to suffering 80 casualties in this abortive battle and to losing 11 tanks, 17 armored personnel carriers, and some trucks. Having failed to occupy the center of Suez, the Israelis now began to withdraw their forces to the outskirts of the city. On the 25th, the Israelis made their third attack on Suez at about 8 a.m. This time, they used one of their Soviet squadrons of some 15 Tiran tanks, supported by infantry in civilian-impressed trucks. Although the fighting continued until about 1550, the Israelis could not break through into the center of the city and had to withdraw with the loss of 10 tanks. Suez, formerly a city of some 200,000, was now partitioned down the main street. The Egyptians held the center of the city, while the Israelis controlled the outskirts. The Egyptians admit that by this time, the road from Cairo to Suez was blocked at kilometer 101. The Israelis claim that on the 26th, the day that marked the end of Ramadan, they had completely encircled the Third Army, scattered leaflets over it, and called on it to surrender. On the other hand, the Egyptians claim that their army, local militia, and civilians were besieging the Israeli pocket on the West Bank. On the 28th, despite the second ceasefire, the Israelis made their fourth and last attack on Suez. Starting at 6 a.m., it lasted for only an hour and was also unsuccessful. At the same time, they tried to push southward to outflank the small Egyptian pocket, but were halted by Egyptian frontier troops. Egyptian rangers and other troops in small sections were in and among the Israelis, passing back information about them. The Israeli pocket was surrounded by 3 tank and 2 mechanized divisions. Regarding territory taken or lost on the Suez Canal front, the Israelis claimed they had crossed over the west bank of the canal, although they admitted there were many Egyptian pockets within that area and were also surrounded by Egyptian forces. The Egyptians had gained and held about 300 square miles on the east bank, but their Third Army was surrounded. However, at the Israeli symposium on the Yom Kippur War held in Jerusalem in October 1975, Colonel Trevor Dupuy stated that it was clear that Brigadier Badari and his Third Army were not on the verge of collapse. Dupuy's perspective highlights the resilience of the Egyptian Third Army and argued that it maintained its combat integrity and defensive positions east of the Suez Canal. Further, Drew Middleton, military editor of the New York Times, wrote, "The Egyptian Third Army did not break. They were still in being, and their continued existence posed a strategic challenge for Israel." The situation was as much a stalemate as it was a siege, although the Israelis did not like to see it that way. Some supplies were flown in at night to the Third Army by helicopter or brought across by boat, and water was obtained from the Ain Musa Springs. Since October 28, 1973, the Egyptian General Command decided not to allow the Israeli forces west of the canal any period of calm or rest, and to prevent them from consolidating their defenses or fortifying them in engineering terms, and to tighten the noose around them in close cooperation with all the surrounding forces. The active defensive actions of Egyptian forces developed to the point that some called this phase Egypt's Second War of Attrition. The Second War of Attrition with Israel began on November 1, 1973, and lasted until March 17, 1974. During these months, there were almost daily incidents of shelling, skirmishes, and patrol raids in the Third Army sector. Edgar O'Balance, British military journalist, mentioned that there was frequent Israeli aircraft action against the besieged army. The Israelis were trying desperately, for prestige reasons alone, to force it to surrender, but they failed. Also, holding out on the East Bank during this period was the besieged Kabrit Fort. which the Israelis also tried hard to force to surrender, subjecting it to constant artillery fire and bombing. The Egyptians consider the defense of Kabrit Fort, taken in 30 minutes and defended for 3 months, to be one of their war epics in which the water shortage was overcome by boiling and vaporizing salt water from the canal. On the West Bank, the Israelis settled themselves in defensive positions and surrounded themselves with mines. Later, the Egyptian Engineer Corps claimed to have lifted 750,000 mines, mainly of US origin, which had been laid in the Israeli pocket. On 9th December, the Egyptians announced that the Israeli pocket was only 3 miles deep and not 10 as claimed by the Israelis, and that there was a plan prepared to encircle and destroy the pocket using 5 divisions and 20 Ranger units. The war of attrition between Egypt and Israel dragged on, although much was hidden from the Israeli nation by military censorship. The shock of being caught by surprise, the failure to capture key strategic cities along the canal, and the huge but as yet unknown casualty figures and the lack of information about missing soldiers and prisoners caused the people to devolve into bitter recrimination as anger overtook fear. The famous Jewish psychologist Richard Lazarus addressed the International Association of Psychologists at its yearly convention in Tel Aviv in 1975. The Israelis are living in a continuous state of trauma. This was the first war that didn't strengthen Israel, as it was a psychological disaster in so much that it destroyed the legend of the invincible army. The biggest danger was replacing this idea by the fear of being under threat at all times. Something was broken at the Yom Kippur War. The state was saved, but our faith is lost. Our confidence is broken, and our hearts are torn, as we almost lost a full generation. A few days after the ceasefire, the Egyptian Armored Corps rushed a large number of tanks to surround the Israeli pocket after repairing and equipping them. In addition to 140 more tanks that had arrived in Egypt from Algeria, 150 tanks that had arrived from Yugoslavia, and 250 tanks that had arrived late from Russia. Thus, Egypt had about 800 tanks that surrounded the Israeli forces west of the canal, which included 400 tanks that had crossed after the ceasefire on October 22nd. The Israelis found themselves caught in a layered entrapment. While they besieged Egypt's Third Army, they were themselves surrounded by Egyptian forces. What had begun as a bold breakthrough was now turning into a trap. Their conditions and their administrative lines were extremely critical at this point. For the Egyptians, the opportunity was ripe. This time, there was no water barrier or fortified defensive line to hinder their advance. The Egyptian forces around them were in a position that did not allow the Israelis to move or deploy to improve their situation, nor did they even allow them to withdraw from their positions without major losses. The Egyptians had already formulated a plan to eliminate the Israeli incursion west of the canal. The objective was clear: to decisively destroy all Israeli forces west of the canal and restore the situation to its state prior to the Israeli breach. This offensive plan was given the code name Shamel, which means comprehensive, and was entrusted to Major General Saad Mamoun in December 13th. In his memoirs, General Saad Mamoun stated, "The enemy lacks strategic balance. Their forces are trapped west of the canal and have failed to push ours back even an inch on the eastern front. Every ration, every drop of water, every artillery shell, every liter of fuel had to travel over 300 kilometers to reach their forces west of the canal through a narrow corridor just 6 kilometers wide. Our plan was to seal off that passage and turn it into a corridor of fire, while simultaneously annihilating the enemy forces in the west. It would have taken no time. The Bar-Lev line taught us that no matter how fortified a position is, it can still be breached. Imagine what we could have done when their forces were completely exposed. In his autobiography, Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan stated that the ceasefire existed on paper, but the continued firing along the front was not the only characteristic of the situation between 24 October 1973 and 18 January 1974. This intermediate period also held the ever-present possibility of a renewal of full-scale war. There were three variations on how it might break out: 2 Egyptian and 1 Israeli. One Egyptian plan was to attack Israeli units west of the canal from the direction of Cairo. The other was to cut off the Israeli canal bridgehead by a link-up of the 2nd and 3rd Armies on the East Bank. Both plans were based on massive artillery pounding of Israeli forces who were not well fortified and who would suffer heavy casualties. It was therefore thought that Israel would withdraw from the West Bank, since they were most sensitive on the subject of soldiers' lives. Egypt, at the time, had a total of 1,700 first-line tanks on both sides of the canal front, 700 on the East Bank and 1,000 on the West Bank. Also on the West Bank, in the second line, were an additional 600 tanks for the defense of Cairo. They had some 2,000 artillery pieces, about 500 operational aircraft, and at least 130 SAM missile batteries positioned around our forces so as to deny us air support. US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger intervened decisively to prevent the implementation of Egypt's plan, a fact he later confirmed in his personal memoirs. The Israeli pocket west of the Suez Canal had effectively become a trap, and Kissinger's visit to Egypt on November 1st, 1973, highlighted the gravity of the situation. During their meeting, President Anwar Sadat outlined the reality to Kissinger, stating, "I have 800 tanks compared to Israel's 400, and for every Israeli tank, I have 1.5 missiles. The Israelis are confined to a strip only 6.5 kilometers wide east of the canal. If we attack, their forces will be annihilated without question." Kissinger acknowledged that he was well aware of the situation. He revealed that the Pentagon had provided him with satellite imagery confirming the reactivation of Egypt's air defense system, along with detailed views of the amassed Egyptian tanks, artillery, and other preparations. But he delivered a stark warning to Sadat. Any attempt to eliminate Israeli forces west of the canal would escalate the situation beyond the Middle East. "We cannot allow a Soviet-backed offensive to succeed against an American-supported position." At 9 o'clock on the morning of January 17th, 1974, Cairo time, the separation of forces agreement between Egypt and Israel was broadcast under the supervision of the United Nations. This agreement was put into effect as of 12 o'clock on January 25th. Israel began withdrawing its forces from the agreed-upon areas, and the separation of forces proceeded in accordance with the agreement. Both sides gained advantages and suffered disadvantages, the Egyptians perhaps gaining far more than the Israelis. The Egyptians gained some 300 square miles of Israeli-held Sinai on the east bank of the canal since October 6, 1973. They destroyed and captured the Bar-Lev Line, the strongest fortification the world had seen since World War II. The Israelis lost the military superiority they had enjoyed over the Arabs for so long, and their military power alone was no longer great enough to deter Arab attacks. From subsequent negotiations, the Israelis were pushed back deep into the Sinai, and ultimately Egypt regained control over all of its occupied territories in the Sinai. The greatest Arab gain, perhaps, from the war was the fact that the haunting specter of the Israeli invincibility was shattered. Sadat went to war not for territorial gain, but to create a crisis that would disrupt the status quo, open the way for negotiations, and increase Egypt's diplomatic flexibility, and he succeeded. Golda Meir acknowledged as much in her memoirs, where she conceded that Sadat's conduct of the war and overtures to the United States put Egypt in a far stronger position diplomatically than Israel. The Yom Kippur War reshaped the Middle East in profound ways. It shattered the myth of Israeli invincibility, restored a sense of dignity and confidence to Egypt and the broader Arab world, and triggered a shift in global diplomacy. For Egypt, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that moved beyond years of tension and military confrontation. The war became a turning point, opening the door to peace and development.